From India's capital, Delhi, I'm Tulika, and this is the PressXpress In Depth podcast. Now, in South Asia, more than 400 million people are severely food insecure. This is about 85% of all the people going hungry in the Asia Pacific, according to the latest data by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO. But what can be done to fix it? What are the reasons behind it? To talk more about this, I have with me food policy analyst and agriculture expert Devinder Sharma. He's joining us from Delhi. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
I want to start by running some more data points by you, sir. 66.1% Bangladeshis, 74.1% Indians, and 82.8% Pakistanis, according to the UN data, cannot even afford a single healthy meal for their families. Why are people going hungry? What are the reasons?
Well, I think it is very obvious when the FAO says that about 74% people are not able to afford a healthy diet. I think it clearly reflects on the nutritional status that the country has built over the years. And compared to our neighboring countries, and if we put them all together, I think this is a region which is suffering the most as far as the nutritional imbalance is concerned. The most important thing for a healthy diet is to see that the people who are at the bottom of the pyramid, they get enough or adequate income so that they can buy their food requirements. I've often been saying that while the emphasis in this entire region is to see that we produce enough food for the country or we meet our food security needs, I think what is missing is that the population which is at the bottom of the pyramid doesn't get or doesn't have adequate income to buy
Hmm.
that quantity of food that is required. And that means that agriculture and as well as the rural wages are at such a low level, people can't afford a healthy diet. Now, let's look at India. In India, we have seen that the rural wages have remained stagnated or declining for the last 10 years or so. And with that kind of decline taking place, how do you expect the poor to have a kind of a fulfilled meal at their table? So I think the
Absolutely.
point I'm trying to make is that we have deliberately kept agriculture impoverished or the farming population impoverished, and that is what ensures or realize or we need to realize that the population at the bottom needs to get a substantial lift if we are able to provide adequate income in their hands. In India, for instance, the situational assessment survey which was done in 2019, situational assessment survey for agriculture household, clearly tells us that the average farming income is 10,218 rupees per month. Now,
Hmm.
10,218 rupees per month is less than the rural wages or Manrega wages that farmers get in India. So I think it
Hmm.
tells us very clearly that this is the part of the country's economy or the country's population which doesn't receive adequate income, and so therefore they are unable to buy the kind of food that they would love to buy for a healthy living.
Yeah, well, 10,000 is still on the more optimistic side. Some of the data that I have with me goes as low as 5,000 rupees per month, an income for the marginal, very, small margin farmer in India. But I also want to point to the other grim situation, which talks about how food inflation and food crisis is leading to social unrests, how hunger is leading to social unrests. And allow me to paint this picture for you when I look at what happened in Sri Lanka in 2022. Even the government was toppled because of unchecked food inflation. In Bangladesh last year, there were protests because the rates of meat and fish shot up by 90%. And in Pakistan, even as we speak now, there are strikes going all over the nation over the wheat crisis. So, my question to you, sir, is why are the food policies failing in these South Asian economies?
Well, I think as you clearly depicted also or showed the condition of food as far as inflation is concerned. The problem arising from food inflation in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan. I think it is quite obvious that that there is a shortfall in the availability of the grain in these particular regions. And that is because, as you all know, that Sri Lanka, when it had the crisis erupting, it was primarily because of balance of payment position, as a result
Yeah.
of which Sri Lanka had to strike or to stop the fertilizer imports, because that was taking quite a
Hmm.
chunk of their foreign exchange. And the government immediately, thought of then moving into what is called as agroecological farming systems or organic agriculture. Now that the country wasn't prepared. So obviously there was a crisis at that particular time in Sri Lanka, and they're gradually emerging out of it. But I guess a seasoned, impact would have been, or a seasoned way forward would
Yeah.
have been for the government to go in phases rather than going abruptly and announcing that we are going to be organic agriculture from tomorrow. So I think
Hmm.
that was one thing which complicated Sri Lanka's position. Now, when I look at Pakistan, I think let's be very clear, it faces again a balance of payment situation and is under severe debt at this particular juncture,
Hmm.
and the government is trying to balance it out, and so therefore there is a focus on how to meet the shortfall in availability of the staple food. I think that is one situation. Now similarly in Bangladesh of course has this requirement of paddy to be focused on more, because after all
Yeah.
it's paddy is the staple food there. But yes, in all these countries, there is a problem with, I would say, also with production levels. And these three
Okay.
countries also have to focus on how to ensure that there is a stability in food production. And this can be assured, I think, like what we have done in India, I think is something, or I would always
Okay.
say, a lesson for the world, especially for the African countries, which are also struggling with the food insecurity, is that we have to be food self-sufficient. And unless the
Hmm.
emphasis is on food self-sufficiency, I don't think we can overcome this particular crisis of
Okay.
inflation
Okay.
if we rely too much on food imports. And food
Right.
imports,
Right.
also we realize that in India and Pakistan, there is a kind of a barrier as far as the trade is concerned, and that also is a limiting factor. If I'm sure the borders would have been open now, I think Pakistan's crisis with food inflation
Okay.
would have been taken care of in a much,
Okay.
I think, kind of a organized way.
And what would be the immediate issues to address if all the South Asian economies were to come together and think of a tighter regional cooperation?
Well, I remember about 2 decades back, the important think tank in Pakistan called the SDPI had come out with a study talking that if India and Pakistan were to collaborate on poverty eradication, they could do a much effective job collectively. I remember in my discussions on the media with the SDPI representatives from Pakistan. Yes, there was an excitement. There was a thinking that both Pakistan and India could come together to fight the biggest enemy, and the biggest enemy is poverty in this particular case. But believe me, at that time also I had said this will not happen. Let's be very realistic. This will
Yeah,
not happen because of the political reasons, for political reasons.
absolutely.
And you have
And
seen
even
when
now,
we
it seems very far fetched to do something like this between India and
That's what I'm
Pakistan.
saying. When we say that we need to do as a region, come together and formulate our policies in a way that it can benefit each country. There can be, let's say, a shortfall in India. There can be a surplus happening in the other countries. So then we can wriggle it out and see, we can come up with a situation that we can balance it out. Both the countries' requirements and so on. But as you rightly said, there is a political dimension that we cannot ignore, and that will continue to be a very important factor in seeing that the reason as such can
Hmm.
emerge out of the food insecurity problem that it faces, because after all we are worse than even sub-Saharan Africa, and I think that should be worrying the region as such.
In Pakistan, the cost of a roti, it's the cheapest kind of South Asian bread. And till last month, it had gone as high up as 30 rupees, Pakistani rupees, which is really, really bad. In Bangladesh, food prices last month crossed 10%, which is the highest in 5 months. Now, there are schemes in India, you were mentioning earlier also, like midday meals or free meals or subsidized canteens. Are these kind of schemes successful? Can these be implemented or replicated in other economies as well?
Well, Tulika, I would like to come up with an argument here which may not be very
Mhm.
conducive to the kind of economic thinking we have globally as well as nationally. In India, we had something being done called as Thali economics,
Yeah.
by the economic department and so on, economic advisors. And I thought it was a stupid initiative, because if when you
Okay.
keep the Thali economics try to give a picture that the prices of thali are stagnant or are not increasing or are increasing marginally. Like for instance, CRISIL comes out with a monthly report talking about the thali prices in India, and you find sometimes they say because aloo pyaj prices have gone up, so therefore
Hmm.
the prices of thali has gone up by 6% or 7% and so on. But basically, what they are
Hmm.
trying to say is that the food prices are under control. Now, this is
Okay.
something which we need to realize. When we keep food prices low, we actually deny the rightful income to the farmer.
Okay.
We are not worried because we only say, oh, we have to worry about consumers. Why do you think farmer is not a consumer? In
Absolutely.
India, if you look at India, 50% of the population roughly is in agriculture, dependent on agriculture, which means 700 million people are dependent on agriculture. And if you keep the
Hmm.
food prices low, that means you are deliberating keeping farm incomes or not denying or not allowing farm incomes to go up. Whereas everywhere,
Wow.
incomes are going up, but except for agriculture. That is why in the beginning I said that the average income of a farming family in India is just about 10,000 rupees a month. Now, it clearly
Hmm.
tells us that this is because of the macroeconomic policies that farm incomes have been subdued or have been kept at that level, which means you keep farmers perpetually in poverty. Now that is what is
Hmm.
hitting, the South Asian countries, whether it is Bangladesh, whether it is India, Pakistan, or Sri Lanka, or the other countries.
Hmm.
We are actually deliberately keeping agriculture impoverished or farmers
Which is
impoverished.
where,
Now, please tell me,
yeah, which is where the
please.
argument of the minimum support price comes in for the
So,
farmers.
yes, the point I'm trying to make is the moment you talk about minimum support price being made a guaranteed price or a legal mechanism, then again the same media and the same kind of thinking erupts, which says that, oh, if the MSP goes up, it will lead to market distortion. Look at it very
Hmm.
cleverly. So all I'm saying is this is also untrue. I'm trying to answer this. That if you look at America,
Yeah.
this year or after COVID, we have seen that the prices have zoomed. Inflation has gone up,
Absolutely.
and there are a number of economists in America who have now begun to say that this is because of excess profiteering by the corporates or by the companies. And even the president has come out openly against that, saying that this price gauging that is taking place in America is not allowed or should not be allowed, and so on and so forth. Now, the point I'm trying to make
Hmm.
is if 50% of the inflation that we see in America is because of the profit that the companies charge, and it doesn't lead to any market distortion. Now, when the
Hmm.
prices in India MSP goes up by, let's say, 25%, then people start saying, oh, it will lead to market distortion. The point I'm asking is
Yeah.
why when the prices inflation goes up in America by 50% because of profiteering, nobody talks of market distortion. Whereas in
Hmm.
India, the moment you say that MSP should be legalized, everyone is up in arms saying that markets will be distorted. So I think it clearly tells us
Hmm.
that the emphasis is to actually keep farm incomes where they are at
Hmm.
present, and I think that is not the way forward. So
And
this, if you
and
provide
sorry
more
to
income to
interject, sir. I just find this very interesting. I want to quickly ask you, what's the kind of MSP that you recommend will not lead to a market distortion in India?
Well, yeah, but to come to that level, let me first make my point clear so that we can all appreciate this flaw in the macroeconomic policies. The moment we talk of MSP going up, or the prices going up, or the food inflation going up, because for food inflation is roughly about 45% of the consumer price index. If you look at the weightage,
Hmm.
now this is again a deliberate ploy. In my understanding, the biggest inflation every household in this region is faced with is basically housing, health, and education. Nobody
Hmm.
talks of housing, health, and education. Why can't CRISIL, which comes out with a monthly barometer for thali economics, or what is the prices of thali, come out with what is the price for, or what is the cost for education, or for health, or for
Okay.
hospitalization? Why doesn't it come
Okay.
out with that? So you deliberately
Fair
want
enough.
to kill agriculture for the sake of the other sectors of the economy. I think this has to be corrected. And that is why I
Hmm.
think the world needs to get away from this mindset that food inflation is the only thing which is worrying, or which should be hitting farming families, or generally the households. The point I'm trying to make is, let us try to make a true estimate of the real inflation drivers, which is basically housing, health, and education.
Hmm. So, housing, healthcare, and education need equal attention in your view. But thali economics, or the cost of the food that you're putting on your plate, is something which is very consumer centric, and perhaps has that perception of connecting with the sentiment of the consumer in a very direct manner, and gives you an overall picture about what's the cost of the food that you're putting on your plate. But you talked about economies, and I want to talk on the other hand how well South Asian economies are witnessing a good and impressive growth rate. And let me bring your attention to India, growing at an impressive 7% annual economic growth rate, aiming to be a developed country by 2047, but has such a sorry ranking when it comes to the Global Hunger Index, 111 out of 125 countries. Now, I know there has been some reaction from the Indian government about not agreeing to this ranking, but is this really an acceptable development standard?
Well, I think let's be very clear. Instead of borrowing the development model from the Western countries and then cut and paste and say, oh, this is the way forward for India, I think we as a nation need to put our head together to see what is the definition of developed country in the years to come. To say that by 2047 we will become a Viksit nation, I think it is okay. These are kind of statements which I think politicians can make and get away with it. But the reality is, please tell me, if the income is concentrated, or the wealth is concentrated in the hands of the top 1% or the top 10%, whereas the rest of the country is living on what is called the food rations, or we call it
Hmm.
in India, the Bharti people, 80 crore people are getting the benefit of free rations. Now, how do you call this a developed nation? Even if we
Hmm.
become a 5 trillion economy, in the days to come, that is what we are being told. We are soon going to be a 5 trillion economy. Please tell me, if 5 trillion economy, why should it get rattled with aloo pyaj prices going up?
Hmm.
How can it get rattled with just aloo pyaj prices going up? Which means the
Absolutely.
design is wrong. How can you will agree that the average household expenditure, okay, or the kitchen expenditure in India, average I'm talking, is roughly about 10,000 rupees per month. And if the
Hmm.
inflation in aloo pyaj or in potato and onion goes up, let's say prices go up, then it will be a burden of another 1,000 rupees or so on a family. Now,
Hmm.
how can that rattle the national economy? I think is a question that we all need to ask. That it is because we have actually kept the real drivers of inflation away from public gaze. So we don't
Hmm.
talk of, as I said earlier, education, health, and housing. So people would never know about it. And your question that there is a sentiment attached to it. Obviously, for last 50 years, if we have been talking about, programming the general public by saying that it is food which is you should be worried about, not your expenses
Hmm.
on education, for instance. You and me. Just think about when I was a student, I studied all through my post graduation level in on
Hmm.
scholarship. Please tell me, where in India do you get that same kind of opportunity now? If families spend or are burdened with the education of their children, and yet we are worried about aloo pyas. I think this has to be corrected. And unless this is corrected, we will never have an answer to your first question: why is 74% of the population in India unable to get a healthy food?
There are 1.4 billion people right now. By 2047, it could be 1.6 billion people, or perhaps before that. But the land that is there for cultivation is limited, and I have my data saying that it's around 156 million hectares of net zone area. So, how urgently should the next government in India be addressing this issue?
This is an issue which I think would be not only common to India, not only particular to India, but common to the
Hmm,
entire region. And also, if you look at
absolutely.
globally, it should be quite evident that the land resource is limited. Now, I think the economic policies that we are following, we have as a one nation or as a region, we have failed to ensure how much land we need for our food security. Why I'm saying this is, in China, I think that's the only country which has a land use policies. They have demarcated, they have said that so many million hectares of land would not be touched, which
Okay.
means you will not have investment coming in for infrastructure or for building roads and whatever, in those areas, because that is what is required for food security. Now, if China can do
Absolutely.
it, I thought India can also do it. And
Hmm.
the other countries, look at America, for instance. America is one country which is the biggest producer of biofuel, ethanol. And they are spending about, they are putting about 40% of their land resources under biofuel. And then at one stage they will say we have no land left to produce food. Now that is because of
Okay.
their flawed economic policies. Why should
Hmm.
India also join that club where they're talking about ethanol production? Do we need food? If I were to answer your question, if we need
Hmm.
food, given the limited land resources, then we should be focusing on food production only. Why are we moving on to
Okay.
producing food for the cars? I think cars can wait.
Hmm.
Automobiles can wait. So these are the wrong policies which actually have exacerbated the crisis that we have in our part of the world. Now, to come back
Okay.
to your suggestions, what should we do? I think we need to, at least for once, accept what China has done. Let us be very clear, out
Hmm.
of the 156 million hectares you talked about, and let us say the country should know that by the year 2050, we would need about, let's say, 140 million hectares. I'm hypothetically giving a picture.
Hmm.
Then I think the country should be very clear that we will not touch this 140 million hectares for any other purpose except for
Okay.
growing food. That is the kind of a
Okay.
policy we need, or a long term vision we need. But
So
unfortunately, that
stricter
is
policies.
coming up.
Stricter policies in utilizing the land resource, but also, do you think South Asian economies, India in particular, also needs to prioritize budget allocations accordingly? If you look at the interim budget that was announced this year, defense got around 6 lakh crore rupees, food and nutrition got 2 lakh crore rupees. Even the United Nations advised India to relook, go for defense budget cuts and give more to food and nutrition. Do you think that's something that will work out? Because every country has its own priorities when it comes to budget.
I'm so glad, Tulika, you raised this question. It is very important for the only, not only at the national polity, but also the society at large to understand this. Now, let me illustrate. It's roughly
Yeah.
70 crore people are dependent on agriculture. The budget allocation, if you see, for agriculture in this country is only 1.25 lakh crore, which means
Hmm.
less than 3% of the annual budget goes to agriculture, which has 50% of the population involved. Okay. Now, which means when you provide only 1.25 lakh crore out of the 48 lakh crore is the annual budget provision, only 3% or less than 3% goes for agriculture. I'm sure you will agree, you cannot expect a miracle to take place. Now, please tell
Hmm.
me, why can't we have a system in a country like India where we give 50% of the annual budget to 50% of the population? Why
Hmm.
can't we say that 24 lakh crore will go for agriculture? And believe me, the kind of Viksit Bharat that you were talking about earlier would happen much faster if we were to provide more money in the hands of the farming population, which means sabka saath, sabka vikas. So
Hmm.
why can't we shift our priorities rather than going by the trickle down effect that the World Bank and IMF had laid down for us, saying that the country should focus on the industrial sector only, and then there will be a trickle down. I think as President Joe Biden of America has publicly acknowledged now, trickle down has failed. What we
Hmm.
need today is to work at the bottom and at the middle rung to see that the economic stature or the economic status of the population at large goes up. And I think that is what is required in India. So if 50% of the country's budget were to go in agriculture, that is what we require, and that is what should be a kind of a prominent message for the world to follow. That is the way forward.
Is
Why
that doable?
always
Is
copying
that
from
doable?
Western countries?
50% of the budget going into agriculture. Do you think that's practical and doable?
Well, this question has been asked to me again and again, and let me tell you, when Mr. Vajpayee became the prime minister first time, I was in a meeting where five or six economists were called to grapple with this, what kind of economic policies the new government should have. And I remember most of my economist friends were telling that we should go for fiscal deficit and current account deficit, reduce that, and so on and so forth. And when the question was
Hmm.
asked to me, I said I think more important would be that you ensure at that particular time, this was 1996, and at that particular time 60% of the population was involved with agriculture. So my argument was, please give 60% of the budget to 60% of the population. You'll be
Okay.
surprised. You'll be surprised. Vajpayee government actually announced that 60% budget will go for agriculture. It created a furor in the country, but unfortunately, that government fell after 13 days. So there is the precedence already happening in India, and I'm sure if
Hmm.
Vajpayee could have done it, this government or the new government can also do it. Why do we
Hmm.
have to go by the macroeconomists who tell us that only the corporate should get the benefit of the economic resources that the country has? I think
Okay.
everyone has the right to that, and that is why I'm suggesting that agriculture, because it involves people from all
Hmm.
castes and religion and so on. Once we ensure that 50% budget goes for agriculture, I think you have not only covered the gap that exists in the socioeconomic
Okay.
parameters and so on. But I think you have addressed, as I said earlier, sabka saath, sabka vikas.
Right, right. It still seems like a far-fetched idea, but interesting to see what's going to happen when the new government comes in. But overall, when you look at the food sector, what are the kind of global threats or climate-related threats that this sector is facing?
Well, we all know that we are into a stage where it is climate boiling now. It is not only climate change, but we have entered into a phase where
Hmm.
the UN chief says it is climate boiling. And in this heat situation or a heating situation, it is quite clear we are that 1.5-degree barrier has also been crossed. I think we are
Yeah.
heading towards a situation where, and as many say, we are reaching the tipping point. That I think everyone agrees. Now, this is going to create a lot of upheavals globally
Hmm.
as far as agriculture is concerned. And we all know that it will start because of the sudden heat wave or cyclones or the drought situation and so on, so forth. We will have a crisis on our hand. That is why I think more important for every country is to redraw its trade policies.
Hmm.
We cannot go on with the earlier trade policies which say, oh, India has so much of surplus, so we should export this much of rice or wheat. No, I
Okay.
think even when we were
Okay.
trying earlier, at the time when the Russia Ukraine war erupted, and when Indian business was telling us that we can
Absolutely.
each and every grain that we have of wheat, and become one of the andata of the world, I had even then said, please be watchful and careful. You cannot allow unbridled export of wheat, because the chances are that the climate, nobody knows about it. Nobody knows that
Yeah.
after 6 months India may be standing with a begging bowl in the international market. And when India enters the market, it is not like Sri Lanka entering the market. When India enters the
Hmm.
market, the prices zoom. and that would be making it very difficult for India to ensure food security within the country. So I think every country has to remap its trade requirements
Hmm.
and see how we can ensure that we have abundant supplies of staple food lying with us at any given time. We can wait
Hmm.
for 4 years and 3 years rather than dispense with the existing stock. Why I'm saying this is, look at China. China is today one of the biggest importer of food in the world. Every year they are importing about
Hmm.
145 million tons of food grains, and they are stocking it. They have a surplus of about 600 million tons already within the country. And if that
Okay.
was situation in India, I'm sure Indian economists would have been up in arms saying, why don't we export? Why do we let rats eat this kind of a surplus and so on and so forth? But China is not doing that, because China realizes that its future depends upon its own food security, and that whether you are
Hmm.
importing, whether you are producing enough food within the country, you need to be sure that you have stocks that the country can look up to.
It
So I
kind of
think
sounds like a tricky balance because on one hand you have so much land resource rule that we are going to produce out of this land and produce our own food. On the other hand, you're also importing it. It becomes a very tricky balance to maintain.
yes, but that is because of our mismatched export import policies. Now, please tell me, the pulses is an important crop for India, right? A big requirement. We are one of the biggest, not one of the biggest, but the biggest consumer of pulses. All these years, we have reached a level that there is still a gap of about 2 to 3 million tons of pulses every year. Now, if the prices are high for farmers, they will give you a better crop. That is, of course, accepted.
Hmm.
But the fact of the matter is, when the harvest is nearing, suddenly we find that the government opens up for imports. So when the cheaper imports come in, obviously it hits the production capacity within the country. So unless
Hmm.
we rationalize our trade policies to ensure that the farmers' interest is not hit, I don't think we can always or anytime be expecting that the farmers will give us a kind of a surplus situation, or a kind of a situation where the country's interests are taken care of, and then we don't have to
Hmm.
rely on imports. Now, this is something that the government
Absolutely.
needs to prepare. But the fact of the matter is, as you also know, that most of the decision that the governments take is swayed by what the corporates are telling them. And so the corporate
Hmm.
interest is in import export. So they are very keen on importing. And so therefore the government is also very keen on importing.
Corporatization of agriculture, do you think that's also a trend across the whole South Asia region, or do you see that only happening in India with the Modi government?
Say again. I'm sorry I missed it.
This corporatization of agriculture, the corporatization interest in export import in agriculture sector, do you see that happening only in the Modi government in India, or do you see that a common trend across South Asia and the wider world?
No, there's no denying that the world is slowly getting into the corporate farming model, and that is something that the United Nations also is worried. I would say superficially, because when they have the food systems conference, they are relying more on the same corporate
Hmm.
approach to tackle the issue of food security and environmental degradation and so on and so forth, or climate change.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, I think what is important is that we do not fall into the corporate agriculture trap, because the world is gradually moving into what is called as agriculture revolution 4.0. Now, so far in India, we have Green Revolution. Green Revolution is
Hmm.
Agriculture Revolution 3.0. When I
Hmm.
say we are moving to 4.0, which means, more of digitalization, precision farming,
Yes.
satellites, and drones,
Agri-tech,
and so on
basically.
and so forth, which means more of concentration of agriculture goes into the hands of conglomerates. And that is something which is going to pick up in India, because the people who actually are very excited about the potentials of digitalization and agriculture and so on actually have no interest in
Mhm.
ensuring that what will happen to 50% of the population which is dependent on agriculture. I think we need
But
to be very.
on the other hand, agri-tech can also be more directly linked to predicting weather patterns, and that can become a useful resource when it comes to climate change, which was one of the biggest threats that the food sector faces going forward.
Yes, that is something that we have heard enough, but I can tell you one thing: you don't have to worry about that high-tech technology that can take care of climate change. I think climate change requires, as I said earlier, to move towards agroecological farming system. Now, let me illustrate
Hmm.
this. In Andhra Pradesh, we have a community managed natural farming system prevailing for the last
Okay.
10 to 15 years. Now,
Hmm.
interestingly, Andhra Pradesh has about 60 lakh farmers, and they have a commitment that by the year 2031 they would be converting the entire 60 lakh farmers to go for non-chemical agriculture. So far, they have
Okay.
already converted about 8 lakh farmers from chemical to non-chemical agriculture. And that
Okay.
natural farming system is now being appreciated all over the world. This is the biggest, agroecological farming system seen anywhere in the world. I think if Andhra Pradesh
Okay.
can do it without any shortfall in productivity and with no suicides taking place in those areas, no damage to
Hmm.
environment, why can't the rest of the country also adopt that particular farming system? So the answer
Hmm.
lies in not moving towards into agriculture revolution 4.0, but to move towards agriculture revolution 2.0. When I say
Okay.
2.0 means we earlier used to have organic farming in this country. I think the next revolution should be getting into natural farming, and this system, as I said, is before all of us to go and see. If Andhra Pradesh can do it in such a successful manner, I see no
Okay.
reason why the rest of the country cannot, take it or adapt it to its own look.
Replicate that model. So more natural, sustainable method of farming is something that India can
Right.
do better with, and of course, the rest of the South Asian economies can also do better with. But you were also mentioning global conflicts earlier, and I have some data from the UN which talks about, it is an interconnected world. And an additional 122 million people are facing hunger in the world since 2019 due to global conflicts, due to climate change that you were mentioning earlier. But, sir, talking about all this politics, trade policies, high tech agriculture, what governments can do or cannot do, at the end of it, isn't it just roti, kapra, and makan, which is the basic right of every common person?
Well, there's no denying. At the end of it, it is roti kapda makan. Now, for roti kapda and makan, and then to say that it's an interconnected world, I think is very, very interesting. And in fact, I would say, if you allow me to say, that it is amusing when I
Yes.
see this argument being flashed around that we are living in an interconnected world. So we
Hmm.
should be taking collectively decisions if we are moving towards, let's say, agriculture revolution 4.0. We already produce food for 14 billion people. The fact of the matter is, one part of the world is living hungry in hunger. The rest of the world is obese. They are living in opulence. If you look at the population of obesity, the way they are
Very
increasing, I
true.
think it's something that we all need to worry
Very
about.
true.
But more importantly, one third of the food that we produce goes waste. Aren't we living in an interdependent world? Aren't we living
Yes,
in an interconnected
absolutely.
world?
This is
Please tell
exactly what
me.
an interconnected world is. And
I'm
food
coming to that.
crisis, by the way, food crisis is
Tulika, let
not
me
just
answer.
about hunger. So I'll
Tulika,
just
let me
complete
answer.
this. I just complete this because I want your views. Food crisis is not just about hunger. It is about obesity. It is about the way everybody is dependent on each other in the world. And it can have its own pros and cons. But so please complete your views.
Well, let me answer that. I think what I'm trying to explain is when we say, yes, the world needs to produce more food, the same companies will come and tell us that we need to, because we are an interconnected world, so you need to follow, let's say, Europe or America, the way they have raised their productivity, which means the way they have used brought in technology and all kinds of chemicals and so on. That is what they will tell
Hmm.
us. But the fact of the matter is, when it comes to distribution of, or saying that who has to reduce the food wastage to see that everyone in the
Hmm.
world is well fed, they go quiet. Now, please tell me,
Yeah.
one third of the food the food wastage that we see in America today is good enough to take care of sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the
Yeah.
food, the gap that we food wastage that we see in Italy, for instance, is good enough to take care of Ethiopia. Now, when did you see, Italy and Ethiopia come into an agreement to see that that surplus or that wastage, food being wasted
Hmm.
in those countries can come to Ethiopia? Where have you seen the American governments joining hand with the sub-Saharan Africa region to see that the food wastage that America encounters is something that can be taken care of by its by sharing it with Africa. The point I'm trying to, these countries will never talk of interdependence when it comes to
Hmm.
taking care of food wastage. But everyone would, because they want input supplies to increase, which means somebody wants to sell fertilizer, somebody pesticides, and then machines, and so on and so forth. So then they will give us a kind of impression that the world is interconnected, and we all fall in that
Hmm.
trap. I'm not against, please don't think that I'm against this
No,
kind of
no.
interconnection. But all I'm saying is, let us balance it out. For that, we need a kind of a saner leadership, political leadership. I don't
Hmm.
see ever G20 discussing these kinds of issues. These are the leaders who should be sitting there and discussing these kinds of
Hmm.
issues which are linked to interconnectivity, and to see how each country can take care of its crisis. To answer your the bigger question, let me tell you, when a couple of years back, when we had this climate negotiations happening in Edinburgh, I remember the then Prime Minister of Botswana had stood up and said the world had produced surplus money to the tune of $25 trillion since 2009, when we
Hmm.
had the meltdown. Did you ever hear some countries talking about sharing these resources? B, let me tell
Hmm.
you, and it said, according to the Brookings Institute, it tells us that you all need $100 billion to take care of poverty and remove it from the face of the planet. You don't have
Hmm.
$100 billion, but you have $25 trillion, which go to the rich people. It goes into the pockets of the rich people. Now, this is something which I thought the world should be looking into when you talk about interconnectivity. Why can't we
Hmm.
just ensure that instead of putting $25 trillion at the disposal of the minuscule of people who are stinkingly rich, why can't we see that this quantitative easing, as we call it, is meant for the public? Why
Hmm.
can't we see that, the $100 billion out of the $25 trillion surplus that we have produced is just a fraction? Why can't we
Hmm.
give that money if the entire global effort is to remove poverty? That isn't that interconnectivity?
Absolutely. Well, well, strong sentiments there on it being an interconnected world or not. And unfortunately, I'm running out of time, but that brings me to the end of the discussion. To simplify, what all this really means is the cost of the food that you are putting on your plate ultimately. In Bangladesh, what used to cost 30 to 35 taka now costs 80 taka. In India, sir, you mentioned 10,000 rupees that a farmer earns in a month, but even if a small marginal farmer is earning 5,000 rupees in a month, they can barely feed the cow, leave alone feeding the whole family. And as my guest today, Devinder says, the interconnected world should do better when it comes to sharing their earnings and their resources, because inequality is really severe. It's really severe when it comes to income inequality, when it comes to food inequality. Well, on that sober note, it is a wrap for today. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us.
Thank you.
And for my viewers, please feel free to stay connected with me on Facebook, X, or email. Till we meet next time, it's Namaste from Tulika.